Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for taking the time and welcome back to our Saturday lessons where we're going to be learning together. And of course, we're still on that tip around savings. So today we're doing our second lesson, which is how to build an emergency fund, right? And we all know that the economy is tough, interest rates are high, and yes, whew, thank God that the tax rates haven't changed. However, it still does not mean that we don't have other financial challenges that we need to face in this tough economy. So hopefully by learning how to build an emergency fund, you're going to be able to actually try and do better when it comes to those unexpected expenses. As usual, I will be switching off my camera and turning to the screen where we're going to be starting with our lesson. Stay tuned. All righty, let us see. All right, so of course, like I said, this is our Savings 102 lesson where we're learning about building an emergency fund. Okay, so what is the purpose of saving? Remember, we spoke initially on our first class where we talked about what is saving, saying that savings are about you putting aside a portion of money. And of course, the purpose of saving is, of course, to save for future and unknown events. Okay, so instead of spending the money immediately, you try and set the funds aside so that you can spend them in a future date. So that is what saving is about, because whenever you save, you're saving because you're trying to spend to save towards this future event, right? And then, of course, what is an emergency fund? Okay, the word emergency already tells you what exactly we're speaking about. An emergency fund, is a financial safety net. That's what you think about when you think of an emergency fund. It's a safety net where you're trying to put aside funds to cover unexpected expenses. And this word is very important because ideally, unexpected expenses speak to certain things that they just happen. And of course, they're unexpected. One example of that, of course, would be death, right? We can never time death. We can never tell individuals to say no one should die this year. Well, I wish we could, but unfortunately, there are certain situations that you can't plan for that just happen and require funds. And with unexpected expenses, the thing is with unexpected expenses is that these expenses are consuming when it's terms of finances. They are draining because firstly, they're unexpected, which means it's something you haven't budgeted for, you have never catered for, and yet you need to now come up with cash out of the blue, right? That's the first thing. Secondly, it's always going to be cash draining because be it, for example, like I mentioned, a death in the family and everybody is contributing, let's say 5,000 rand. Now you need to start raising 5,000 rand from which account, from which expenses. And that's the thing, when unexpected expenses happen, it does not mean it tells your other expenses, no, listen, guys, please go on pause. We're not paying for electricity this month. We're not paying for food. We're not paying for anything because we've got an unexpected expense. No, you still need to pay for your other obligations. You still need to pay for school fees. You still need to pay for electricity, water. You still need to buy food. There's nothing that you can put on pause on your budget to cater for this unexpected expense. So that is why it's so financially draining, because on top of the fact that it's an expense, it's unexpected and you don't have the cash sitting around to just be able to pay for this particular expense. And that's where the emergency fund comes in. Because when you start saving towards an emergency fund, you try to cater and cover yourself as a safety net against these unexpected expenses. Someone passes on, sure, everybody needs to contribute 5,000 Rand. Instead of you going to a loan shark or going to a bank to get a loan, borrowing money from friends, using a credit card, you can then just quickly go to your emergency fund and withdraw the funds that you need in order for you to contribute to such situations, right? And circumstances like death. So that is the purpose of the emergency fund and why we actually have emergency fund. And that's why it's important, because currently what people normally do when they are encountered by or a situation or they encounter a situation they have not planned for, the first thing they think about is credit, right? And understanding the different types of credits is important, and that's why we're going to also learn about, when we're learning about debt, we need to actually dissect the different credit products so that everybody understand when and what product do you use at wins and at which situation. So currently we always think that when we need money we think of credit. However, there are certain situations where you shouldn't be borrowing money for. I mean, in this day and age we should be saving and having funds, at least 5,000 Rand sitting somewhere in account waiting for certain emergencies, right? You cannot be living a life currently where you're thinking that if you have a situation that requires 5,000 Rand, you now need to go and get a loan, right? That is what currently normally happens. You go get a loan, you go to a loan shark, you borrow from friends. Why don't you have an emergency fund? Because these are the type of expenses that pop up and you need to pay for them at that point in time. And the annoying thing about unexpected expenses is exactly that. They are unexpected and they're demanding because they are time sensitive. You can't, for example, if you've got a vehicle, right? And you wake up one morning and two of your front tires have burst for whatever reason, or someone slashed them. You're not going to say, okay, I'm going to fix this next month. How are you going to travel to work? How are you going to continue with your livelihood if you don't have your means of transportation, unless you're saying that I'm going to start using public transport, right? You can't say when you have an emergency expense, you don't an unexpected expense that requires an emergency fund, you can't say put you on pause, I will cater for you in 3 months. No, it requires the funds right there and there. Like I used the example about death. You can't say to your family members, sorry guys, I don't have my contribution. Can so and so cover me? I will pay you back in maybe the next 2 or 3 months. No, other guys in the family are going to say, no guys, I'm also going to be put out of budget. Why should I pay for your contribution? You need to make a plan. And normally making a plan then means what? Going and getting a loan, going to a loan shark, right? So these unexpected expenses are time sensitive. They need you to have funds right there and there. And the only way for you to plan towards these unexpected expenses is if you have an emergency fund. You have money that you put on the side every month so that you can be able to build this particular emergency fund. And of course, there are characteristics that make up an emergency fund. So I always say that there are three things that you need to consider when you're thinking about an emergency fund and building towards an emergency fund. Firstly, of course, is consistent contributions, right? These contributions need to be consistent every month. That is the first one given. Secondly, easy access to the funds, right? And of course, type of an investment account. So easy access on the funds, right? This easy access of the funds and then the type of investment work hand in hand, okay? And you will see that shortly when we now go into each one individually. So let's start with consistent monthly contributions, right? So for you to be able to identify how much money you can save on a monthly basis, the first thing you'd have to do is go back to your budget, back to basics, right? So for you to say that I can save 2,000 Rand, 500 Rand, 1,000 Rand, you cannot just pull that figure at the top of your head. You need to go back to your budget. Sit down with your budget and calculate. Take out all your variable expenses, all your fixed expenses. See how much you've got left over, right? And then you can identify truly to say, okay, this is how much I can afford. And the reason I use the word I can afford is because if you are going to just pull a figure out of the top of your mind, right, and say, I'm just going to save 1,000 Rand every month, 5,000 Rand in a month, you find yourself in either one of two situations. One, right, you are saving more than you can afford, right? Because you haven't sat down with your budget. And the problem with that is that you will start running out of money during the course of the month. And then instead of you having the remaining funds in your account carry you from the 24th of February to the 24th of March, you're going to start running out of money during the course of the month, right? You don't have money for bread, you don't have money for fuel, you don't have money for this. And then you're going to start going to the emergency fund to carry that shortfall. And that's not the purpose of the emergency fund, because you running out of money or not having money to buy bread during the month is not really an emergency. That's just poor planning and lack of budgeting. An emergency is that unexpected expense, right? So how is it an unexpected expense for you to run out of bread because you eat bread every day? So how is that unexpected? You know that you eat maybe a loaf of bread in your household. You consume 3 or 4 loaves of bread a week or in 2 weeks. So how is that unexpected? Because you are familiar with what your household consumption is. So that is why it's important to do the budget first. Identify how much money you can afford to save. So the other problem about not starting with your budget when you want to identify how much you can afford to save is that you could find yourself saving less, right? You could possibly find yourself in a situation where you are sitting with 10,000 Rand after all your expenses. And instead of saving 5,000 Rand a month, you start saving less than what you can afford, which means now you can afford to save 5,000, but you then choose to save 1,000 Rand because you didn't do the calculation. You just thought of a figure at the top of your head and say, I'm going to save 1,000 Rand every month. So now potentially in a situation where you could be saving up to 60,000 Rand a year, because it's 5,000 Rand a month, in 12 months, that would be 60,000. You are saving 1,000 Rand every month, and you are actually saving 12,000 Rand a year instead of 60,000 Rand, right? So already you can think about that. You're already losing potentially 38,000 Rand that you could be saving towards your emergency fund because you were not able to do the first step, which is identifying how much can I save so that I can have consistent monthly contributions. So if you identify what you can save and how much you can save, it then gives you an opportunity to then say, hey, I can possibly afford to put this money aside. And then now you know that every single month, this is the set amount of money I'm saving on a monthly basis towards this emergency fund, right? So those are the two main reasons that I say start with a budget. Go back to your budget, go back to basics, identify, do your calculations, do your variable expenses, your fixed expenses, then have a surplus or a deficit, right? And if you find yourself that you are in a deficit and say, actually, I cannot afford to save right now, then it's now work that you need to do to say, okay, in my variable expenses, which expenses can I start reducing and paying up quicker so that I can free up some money? Because truth is, you're not going to get more money just because you're running out of money. Your employer is not going to start saying to you, oh, I'm sorry, you don't have enough money to save. Oh, okay, I'll give you an increase so that you have money to save. No, that's not how life works. You make do with what you have. So if you don't have money to save and you cannot afford to save because you have too many obligations, you need to look at those obligations and start identifying which of those obligations do I need to minimize, right? Can I afford, if I'm not saving, how can I afford going out with the girls and my friends during on the weekends once a month? How can I afford that if I don't have a savings plan, right? So I need to cut that out. How can I afford buying new clothing, right? If I don't have a savings plan, then I need to cut that out. So sitting down with your budget, I say it's back to basics because it's an important step to take. It gives you direction, right? We spoke about this when we talked about budgeting. It gives you direction. So, be it you can't afford to save right now, you are able to identify really, really, why can't I afford to save? Where am I misusing my money? Where can I start reducing my expenses so that I can see how much I can start saving, on a monthly basis? Maybe if I pay off that credit card sooner, I can free up this 1,000 Rand that I'm paying towards this credit card. Maybe if I pay up this personal loan, I can start freeing up this 2,000 Rand a month to put towards my savings. Then that's the kind of work that you need to do. But you're only able to do that if you take the time to go back to basics and actually consult your budget. Consult your budget to have a look to see how much can I afford. And once you're able to identify that figure, right? then you're able to actually start planning towards that saving in terms of building your emergency fund, right? So that's the first step. Consistent monthly contributions that can only be determined if you do what? Go back to basics and identify your affordability based on your budget. Just to illustrate this, right, I want us to go back to Tammy. We spoke about Tammy when we were doing our class on budgeting. And here's Tammy, right? And she has a financial goal to want to save more money. So she's got her budget put down on a nice spreadsheet, broken down in a sense that, broken down to say that here's the monthly expenses. So here she goes. She's got her fixed expenses, of course. Remember that. We broke it down in terms of all the fixed expenses. And if you don't remember what we learned, or you've maybe forgotten about the fixed expenses, ideally, these are expenses that remain the same for 12 months, right? Or more. So it means that if you're going to be paying this particular expense for the next 12 months, then you allocate it under fixed expenses. So example, of course, school fees doesn't change every month. Insurance doesn't change every month, right? Your vehicle finance doesn't change every month. So these are fixed expenses, okay? Then, of course, your variable expenses. And like I said, if you find yourself in a situation where you say, I cannot afford to save, this is where you normally actually need to come to your variable expenses to try and identify what can I cut down? What can I reduce? What can I cancel, right? Subscriptions that I can cancel. Can I afford to have a Netflix account? Can I afford to have a Showmax account? That's the kind of due diligence you need to do, right? And a deep dive that you need to do in terms of your personal finances. What can I afford and what can I not afford so that I can try and learn how to save and free up my money to try and save more, right? Okay, I'm not sure what's going on with this mouse today. So once you've identified, like Tamisha has identified, that she's going to be saving 3,000 Rand a month towards her savings plan and her emergency fund, right? So, of course, easy access to the funds is the second step, right? And the reason I say easy access, and this then goes hand in hand in terms of selecting the right investment account, it's because if you want to have an emergency fund, the access of those funds is very important. You cannot have an emergency fund and yet you can't have access to the funds. Then it defeats the purpose. The purpose of the emergency fund is for you to have funds put aside for an emergency. And if you have an emergency, you need to be able to access those funds at the point in time when you need to use the funds, right? And of course, once you've identified the right account, then creating a monthly stop order that is going to be debiting from the primary account, which is where you get your salary or you get your income, then that money will be taken from that account into this now new investment account that you've opened, right? And if we look at the type of investment account, right? So easy access is the first thing we spoke about. And of course, the type of account will then come into play, because when you walk into a bank, normally that's what happened. When people will walk into a bank and say, I want to save money, and then the consultant would say, oh, okay, cool. Here are the products that we can offer you. And unfortunately, right, sometimes you find yourself in a situation where you walk into a bank and they have just launched a new investment account. And in that launch, there's this amazing investment account, and it's got this interest rate, it's got these features and that feature and that feature. Chances are, when you walk into the bank, right, and they are trying to sell as many people this account, meaning that to get more people to open this particular new investment account, chances are the consultant is going to convince you to open this particular investment account, even though it's not actually what you're looking for, right? This is why I always say the onus is on you, right? Because at the end of the day, this is your money, okay? This is your money, it's your future, it's your plans, everything is orientated around you. So the important thing is to remember that. And if you remember that, then you know that the responsibility ultimately lies with you to ensure that you get the right product. So there is no way you can walk into a bank and start asking questions about investment accounts when you have never Googled, different investment account offered by X bank, right? You need to do that work yourself so that when you go to the bank, you're just going there to now open the account because you've already done the research. You've already identified whether this account is going to have easy access or this account is going to give you any forms of challenges. For example, if you're looking to get access to these funds, right? And so opening, for example, a fixed deposit. Why would you open a fixed deposit? I mean, the word fixed already tells you that it's not easy access, right? But sometimes people do that because they got to a bank and they were selling this new fixed deposit with this amazing interest rate, and you got convinced to open a fixed deposit. And then the question is, how is that an emergency fund if the funds are going to be fixed, right? So easy access is such an important thing. And for you to identify and get the right investment account, you need to do the legwork. You need to go sit down, go on Google and go to whichever bank you want to bank with. And like I said initially, when we spoke about savings, that the only way you instill discipline is when you open an investment account that is outside your primary bank. So if you are, for example, you get your salary and your income maybe at Capitec, then you need to go to open your investment account at FNB, Standard Bank or ABSA or Nedbank or any other bank except the bank that you are getting your primary income in. Because remember, we spoke about the challenges that people face when they want to save. And we said that for you to try and deter yourself from using these funds, you need to put up stumbling blocks. So when you open an account outside your primary banking account, then it means that's a stumbling block because every time you want to access those funds, you'll have to go to a different bank, right? And not having access means that you shouldn't take an account that gives you a card. If they give you a card, put the card under the bed, put it in a freezer. I've seen so many things people do to try and prevent themselves from using, a particular account. So try and ensure that you are adding another stumbling block by not having accessibility to that particular account, right? Access to the account in terms of having access to the funds when you need it and access to the funds anytime are two different things because we're trying to instill discipline. So that's why I wouldn't say to people, open a fixed deposit because fixed deposit is a problem because you can't open a fixed deposit that is less than 90 days. I mean, if you've got a burst tire or you've got a plumbing issue, are you really going to wait 90 days? No. And of course, the penalty of withdrawing funds early is high. So it's important to identify which investment account works best. And when I talk about investment account and identifying it, I like these two kind of accounts. And I normally, a lot of these different banks have these kind of accounts. Either a 7-day notice or a 32 days, right? And the reason I say this, it's because yes, there's notice that you put in. However, in a situation where you can no longer, cannot wait for the notice, and you put in immediate notice, meaning that you need the funds immediately, the penalty on a 7-day notice and a 32-day notice is less compared to you going and putting an immediate notice on a fixed deposit, because the penalty will be higher because ideally those funds were meant to be fixed for a longer period of time. So that is another consideration that you need to take, because you don't want to open an account that is always going to be penalizing you every time you withdraw funds immediately, okay? So you don't want to be losing money because every time there's a penalty imposed, that's taking away from the money you're saving. And we don't want that. So 7-day, 32-day, at least the penalty is not that bad if you need to withdraw the funds immediately. Those are the kind of things you need to consider when you're opening, a emergency fund. Does this investment account give me easy access to the funds? Yes. 7-day, 32 days. And I know someone else would say, but why, Nonjabulo, don't you then open, for example, I think they call them money markets, right? Money markets account, you can have access to the funds immediately. You can literally just transfer the money from your check, from the money market into your check account or savings account or whatever. But remember, we spoke about discipline, okay? This fund is meant to be an emergency fund. And the only way for you to start teaching yourself discipline and ensure that you don't utilize the fund for something that it's not, it's when you are able to put stumbling blocks. So your first stumbling block, of course, is opening an investment account in a separate bank from your primary bank, number one. Stumbling block number two, you open a 7-day or a 32-day notice account, right? Because you need to put in notice when you need the funds, right? And the reason I say don't open a easy access account like a money market or any account where you can immediately just withdraw the money, it's because if you have immediate access to those funds, you are no longer going to start treating it as an emergency fund. You are now going to treat it like a little piggy bank where you are running out of bread, right? During the month, you go into this account and you withdraw money to buy bread. You run out of taxi fare, you go and withdraw money from this account. That's not the purpose of an emergency fund, right? That's just you and poor planning. So when you ensure that you save, right? Please, hi guys, please can you mute if you're joining the class so you don't disturb the rest of us? Thank you. So if you are able to actually put in a 7-day notice, 32-day notice, it allows you to then try and instill that bit of discipline and deter yourself from utilizing the funds for something that they are not meant to be used, right? So having a 7-day notice, 32-day notice, that's the great way to go. Fixed deposits, no, that's more long-term, right? And we're going to be learning about that in our third class, where we're going to be learning about building a lump sum, building towards a lump sum account. And so long-term investments, that's where you talk about fixed deposit. So 7 days, 32 days, these are perfect for you to actually utilize as emergency fund accounts, okay? Because they give you easy access. However, they also instill a bit of discipline because you are not able to actually access the funds immediately, all right? Because you've put in those little stumbling blocks for yourself, okay? So look at Tammy. Right, she's identified that she can save 3,000 Rand a month, and then she opens a 32-day notice account, and then she decides to create a stop order, right? So a stop order is another third way for you to ensure that you're instilling discipline. We said the first way to instill discipline when you're saving is open an investment account outside your primary bank, number one. Number two, make sure that the easy access of those funds, right? You don't have easy access to those funds in the sense that it's not an immediate account. You don't have a card linked to that account. You don't have internet banking that can give you access to that account, right? Because you want to create these little stumbling blocks so that you don't utilize the funds for something they're not, right? We said that there's a difference between an emergency fund and a piggy bank or a petty cash, because you are not meant to be using the account to withdraw money to buy bread, okay? And then the third thing, of course, is having a stop order. We've already identified how much we can afford to save on a monthly basis. And for us to be able to be disciplined in ensuring that we are putting this amount of money into this account every single month, the only way we can do that is if we open a stop order. Okay, and the purpose of that stop order is this: you creating your self-generated debit order. That's what I call it, because that amount of money will go off on your account like clockwork, right? So if you go to the bank and say, please load a stop order on the 24th of every month, so without fail, on the 24th of every month, a portion of that amount would go off. So for example, 3,000 Rand here in Tammy's example, 3,000 Rand will always be credited into that little 32-day account that she's open, right? And that amount of 3,000 Rand will always be debited from her primary account where she gets her salary or her form of income, okay? And then look at it now. Tammy has now accumulated, after 12 months, she's managed to accumulate, 36,000 Rand. So, in a situation where there is a death in the family, she's got plumbing issues, she needs to actually buy new tires. There's so many scenarios that come up and pop up in situations where you need funds and you don't have those funds, and for you to be able to actually contribute or pay towards that unexpected expense, instead of you going to a loan shark or getting a loan at the bank or using some form of credit to finance this particular unexpected expense, you can now utilize your emergency fund, because that's what it's built for. So it's not an account for you to say that your emergency fund is an account for you to plan a birthday party for you. That's not an emergency. I mean, you have a birthday every year. How is it an emergency for you to plan a birthday party for this particular year? It's not a fund for you to say, I want to go on a vacation with friends, or I want to go on a vacation with my lover. That's not an emergency, right? The word emergency is very important. So every time you try and access funds from this account, you need to ask yourself, is this an emergency? Right? Because sometimes there are certain situations that come up, and they come in the form of an emergency because the people around you maybe could be putting pressure on you to pay, to probably purchase this or make contribution towards that. But is it an emergency, right? Just because your friends thought of going for a trip, and this trip needs to be booked before June, so that everybody can go on this lovely cruise. That's not really an emergency. It's just poor planning, right? So having to be able to identify what is the difference between emergency and what is not an emergency helps you to ensure that you are keeping to you using these funds for what they are meant for, and you don't find yourself in a situation where you are withdrawing money from your emergency fund for things that are not considered an emergency, right? And that is it, of course, with our lesson for today around building an emergency fund. And I will pause to just find out if there's any questions. And I will see that if there's no questions, of course, then we will definitely put a stop to this lesson and end the lesson here. And then, of course, if we have questions, of course, it gives us an opportunity to further discuss the emergency fund, the purpose of the emergency fund, and how you can build the emergency fund. And of course, what I really wanted us to take away from this class is that to ensure that people understand that building a emergency fund is not an impossible task. It just requires discipline, and the only way you can actually create that discipline is by utilizing those three indicators that I shared with you, and those three steps that I shared with you as to how to instill discipline when you're trying to save. So if I have no questions, I will say good night and thank you so much for joining us. Until the next lesson, have a good evening. Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.